back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws. This is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe, like, turn on our noti bells, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at the OBT Podcast to stay in touch with us. Um, but for this episode, we've got an interesting little segment that we're gonna do. I can't remember what episode it was that we did pretty not early on, but middle of more of our recent episodes. We did a segment where we kind of pose some questions to each other, and we kind of wanted to continue with that, but focusing more on some teams that are in the playoffs or going to be in the playoffs this year. And just to specify, I think I messed up the intro a little bit, but this is more geared towards X factors on the team that we're talking about. So my apologies if I messed that up. I can't remember right now. Um, so yeah, to kick it off in the East, my question for everyone is for the 76ers. Is Embiid enough to get out of the East? And to answer my own question, I don't think so. Just because Embiid to me isn't Giannis. And when it comes to the Bucks, we have to always talk about how perfectly constructed their team is and whatnot. We've said it multiple times on the podcast that that's our favorite in the East by far. It's not even close. But with Embiid, it's just there's a number of variables going on with him, and I feel like it's just the team isn't crafted around him. It's a different situation where you have Tatum in Boston, and it seems like the team is crafted around him. Same with Giannis, but with Embiid, it's just like Harden. I don't think is the right fit for Embiid. Maxey could be, but we haven't even seen the real potential with him being bench sometimes. It's just a weird situation that they have going on over there. But I just don't think that it's enough to even get to the Eastern Conference Finals, if you want me to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, I guess with Philly, again, we've kind of talked about it multiple times where it's like, it's not so much that Philly is bad at all because they're a good team. It's
Right.
just, it would be hard for me to pick them over the Bucks or the Celtics. With the Bucks, obviously Giannis, he can match Embiid. And I guess like in terms of matchup wise, right, Embiid's got the size to kind of battle with Giannis, whereas Boston doesn't necessarily.
Right.
Um, but at the same time, I think Boston has more reliable options, right, in a playoff setting because you also have to, a big part of your offense also relies on what Harden can do,
Mm-hmm.
and, in the playoffs every year, no matter what situation, he's usually been less effective than in the regular season.
Yes.
His style of play has changed from what it used to be, right? Because obviously earlier in his career, he drove a lot more, got to the line a lot more.
Right.
Now he kind of looks to, beat teams more so with his jumper off the dribble. I mean, he can still kind of get to the basket, but it's just not the same. And he's still an effective player. And he's always been a good passer, but I just don't think you can rely on that combination in the playoffs. Just,
Yep.
And again, like, it's a good duo. It's just not, in my opinion, good enough to beat those other two teams, I think.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah. It's just not strong enough. That's what it comes down to. There's other
Yeah.
teams that are better, and
Yeah.
come playoff time, I think Philly fans will be in for a
Mhm.
rude awakening. So
Yeah. Yeah, like, I wouldn't necessarily blame it on Embiid because,
no.
like, he could have a great series, and potentially carry them, but I just think, like, you still need some other guys to step up, and
Yep.
I just don't know who's gonna step up. There are guys that they have, right? Maxey, Harden, Niang, Harris, can kinda come and go, but after that, like, you just don't know, right? Anthony
Right.
Melton's been good, but still, against these other teams, I don't know if those guys are gonna show up in a playoff setting.
Yeah. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah. So for my team, or for my first team, I chose the Bucks, and for my X factor, Chris Middleton.
Okay.
And obviously this is pretty obvious. He was a big part of their title team. He was essentially their second best player. Um, next to Giannis, great fit. Being able to score off the dribble in the pick and roll. Solid defender, solid playmaker. He's been kind of rough and rusty this season. He's just battled a ton of injuries.
Right.
The last few games, in the last 3 games that he's played, so against Orlando, he had 24 points, 11 assists, right? Again, it's Orlando, but, that's kind of the first step is to just kind of get back on the floor and start playing well. Didn't have a great game against Brooklyn. Had a an okay game against the Warriors. He just had, a couple of bad possessions late in the game with
Right.
turnovers. But overall, it was a stronger performance. And, so these last 3 games, I think that's a good, assessment of where he's at, where he's better than what he was earlier in the season. And so if he can just continue to get better and get closer to what he was, right, I think that will obviously be a much needed shot in the arm from Milwaukee. I mean, because they've already been really good. It's just
Right.
obviously if Middleton can get back to what he was, they'll be even better.
Yeah. With Middleton, I think he's the X factor for sure because when he comes back, that's either your, a really good number 2 or a great number 3 guy. So no matter what shape he comes back into, I think they'll be trending in the right direction. The only place they
Yeah,
can really go from here is up with Middleton back in the rotation.
agree.
But yeah, for my Heat X factor, spoiler, my question is for the Heat. Um, and my X factor is Jimmy Butler because we all know playoff Jimmy is a different kind of player than the regular season Jimmy Butler. And as we get closer to the end of the season, he normally turns on the Jets. And I don't know if it's enough to make a deep run, but my question is with playoff Jimmy activated, could we see the Heat make a return to the conference finals? And I think if they play their cards right and everything falls in line for them and goes their way, I think they could go back to the conference finals. It'll be tough, but I don't think they could get beyond that. But we could see them make an appearance there.
I mean, the last 5 games for him, or the last 6 games for him, 33 points,
Yeah.
15 points, 26, 28, 33, 38. The free throw attempts obviously are there. The assists, the rebounding is there. So he's been really good as of late. He stepped
Yep.
up. For him, they've kind of morphed him into like a, what I would say like a 16 game player,
Right.
right? Where like in the regular season, right, he kind of played, obviously he plays well, right? But you can kind of tell that there's like another gear that he's saving for the postseason.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the X factor, like you said, for Miami, because if he's the best player on the floor in a series, depending on who they play, that can really shake things up. If they play, if they somehow get to 6, or something like that, and they play Philly in the first round, and Jimmy Butler, matches Joel Embiid
Right.
in terms of production, right? That can get kind of scary for Philly.
Mm-hmm.
Just because again, if you have the best player on the floor or somebody who can play like the best player on the floor, you always have a shot in a playoff series. Other guys, obviously, Bam Adebayo, he's been really good, but Tyler Hero, I think needs to be a little bit more consistent.
Right.
You're getting pretty much nothing out of Duncan Robinson, nothing really out of Kyle Lowry, right? These are guys that they were kind of relying on in previous years, especially Robinson, who had been there for a while. Lowry was there last year, but he's been hurt, and so you're just kind of left wondering, like, what do you do? Because some of the other moves that they made hadn't necessarily panned out. Oladipo's been okay, um, but Tucker's gone, and he was a big part of their team.
Right.
So it's been a rough year for Miami, but I don't think you can necessarily count them out because again, they've kind of shown time and time again, like Jimmy Butler can turn it on in any series. Didn't have a great series against Milwaukee a couple years ago, but outside of that, he's been pretty much great every postseason he's played in.
Yeah, they're a really good fighting team. Yeah, I'm curious to see how far they go.
Yeah. So my next team is Cleveland.
Okay.
And so my X factor, I guess I would have is Evan Mobley.
Okay.
So for him, he's had, I think, over the last few weeks, right? He's had like a really impressive second year jump, that seems like it's kind of just come at the right time.
Right.
So his last several games, 18 points, 9 rebounds, um, you know, 12 points, 4 rebounds, not great there, but another game with 25 and 17. So he's had some huge performances, over the last several games.
Right.
And Cleveland kind of needs it because they've had some issues offensively at times. That combination with Mobley and Allen, can sometimes be problematic just because neither of them are really floor spacers. And they still have problems on the wing. The bench isn't ideal. They're not that great on the road. But if Mobley can kind of, figure some stuff out, like it seems like he's been doing as of late, and he can kind of turn into like, not necessarily the third star, but if he can kind of turn into like, that next level big man, right, where he goes from solid player to really, really good, I think that can kind of make Cleveland more interesting come postseason time, where maybe they can win, maybe more than one round. I think it would be tough because you would have to still probably beat one of Boston or Milwaukee, but you never know, right? In the 7-game series, Mitchell could play amazing, and
Hmm.
if they get a couple guys, they could always kind of go a little bit further than expected. But I think he's probably for them one of their biggest X factors, aside from their bench, because it's been really inconsistent. Because as I said, when you have a guy like Karis LeVert who's billed as a scorer, but
Yeah.
he hasn't really scored as of late, and especially in terms of efficiency, that just makes it tough, right? Kevin
Yeah.
Love didn't really work out. Rubio hasn't really been, that outstanding, right?
Right.
So it's just you kind of have to rely more on your starters, I guess, if you're Cleveland.
Yeah.
And
I
I
mean,
think that starts with Evan Mobley.
yeah, that's a great point you raised. I thought you were gonna pick Donovan Mitchell because that's how important he is to the team, but Mobley's a big difference maker. I think when he plays well, the team also plays well. It's kind of one of those situations where it's like, when he's when he's kind of shaky, which he was earlier in the season, you could see why they had a lot of doubters in how far they would go. But you know, with Mobley taking the right, making the right strides and going in the right direction, trending in the right direction, I think we could easily see Cleveland going potentially pretty far. He brings a lot to the table: defense, rebounds, offense. He's an all around big. The only thing he doesn't
Yep.
have is that consistent three, which I think will maybe come to him over time, but not in this moment. And they don't necessarily need that right now. It would help them, but they don't need it. Need it. But yeah, I'm hyped for Cleveland. I love their young roster. They're a great team, and with Mobley playing better, the sky's the limit for them. Um, so for my team, it's the Knicks. Um,
Okay.
and my X factor is R.J. Barrett. So my question is, you know, if RJ doesn't play well in the playoffs, do you potentially move on from him? Do you take a swing at a star, maybe give away some of your younger players with RJ? Maybe a RJ Obi package. Do you trade that away and automatically become really good contenders, or do you stick it through with RJ and hope that it's just growing pains? And I think they're gonna stick it through with him just because he's such a high lottery pick, and he has a lot of potential too. Coming out of Duke, he was, second to Zion, which is pretty good comparison. Just in terms of the skill. And, he's shown the flashes. It's there. It's just they need to figure out a way to harness it. So I don't think they'll move on, but if he plays well in this postseason, I think we could be seeing, you know, some really big RJ moments throughout the rest of his career, hopefully as a New York Knick.
Yeah, I mean, the thing for him is consistency, right? Because obviously he's had games, where he's been really good, right? Against the Celtics, right? He had 29 points, in that double overtime game, played 50 minutes. Um, but the issue has been the 3-point shooting has just that's the other aspect of his game that really, really needs to improve. I mean,
Yeah.
he'll have games, the occasional games where he shoots well from three, but also a lot of other games where it'll be like 3 for 9, 1 for 7, 1 for 8. As I'm just kind of reading them off here. So I think if he kind of disappoints, I mean, obviously, he was probably going to be a big part of that potential Donovan Mitchell Knicks trade. So I feel like contract wise, he's probably the guy that they would have to kind of move if they want to get another star. I
Right.
mean, they have other contracts like Evan Fournier, um, but like teams aren't necessarily going to be in super demand for those guys, right? It would probably be more so like an RJ Barrett, and
Right.
he's going to be on a max contract, I think, starting next season, I think,
Yep.
right? So for him, he has to get better because once he is in that max contract range, right, people are going to look at him differently
Differently.
than they
Yeah.
do right now, and he's already kind of a polarizing player. But
Right.
if he's like up and down and not necessarily consistent, while also being paid, like 30 million a year or 20+ million a year,
Right.
that's just not going to be a good look. So I think they'll stick with him for now, but also like it depends on who's available. Because if there's somebody that's available that the Knicks would really want, I don't think they would hesitate to move him.
Yeah. I agree with that.
Yeah. So my team is the other New York team, the Brooklyn Nets. This is my third team. So my question or X factor, I guess, is for Ben Simmons.
Okay.
So so obviously he's been in and out of the lineup. Right now he's been out because he's been hurt.
Right.
Really hasn't been a real part of the rotation in quite some time. And obviously, we all know like the documented struggles with his game this season. Early on, it looked like a mess, right? Then he had a brief stretch where he looked, more like himself,
Right.
right? Then came off the bench at different points, then went back into the starting lineup, and now he's back coming off the bench, and now he hasn't really played at all. So I do kind of wonder for Brooklyn. I mean, they've been winning, right? So they've been pretty solid as of late. The trade that they made when they dealt Kevin Durant and Kyrie, right? Getting back Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, it's really helped them.
Right.
They got a ton of wings. They still have good shooting. They have some vets. Like Seth Curry and Joe Harris that sometimes can kind of come around. They had that one game right against Milwaukee where they went down big early, pulled all the starters, right, and then brought the bench back, and then brought the bench in, and the bench got them back into the game. They didn't win it, right, but
Right.
it was a close game.
Yeah.
Um, but you do kind of wonder with Ben Simmons, what's the next step for him, right? Because if he actually does come back this season, and he plays, right, he's only got like 2 more years left on his deal, and that's kind of a big deal because you do kind of wonder like if this is who he is, right? Like where's he gonna go? I mean, because Brooklyn hasn't really played him at all, since the trade.
Right.
I know, and again, I know he's been hurt, but still, like he wasn't playing a whole lot before the injury, so you just kind of wonder, will he ever kind of get back to himself? Because if he actually, played a little bit better and got closer to himself, right, Brooklyn would probably be even better. I still wouldn't pick them to go far, right, but they would be, an even more interesting team if you had a more unlocked version of Simmons. But I guess at this point, you just don't really know. And that's kind of why I have him as an X factor because it's kind of the ultimate X factor, right?
Yeah.
Because if he can, refine his game, right, then that, unlocks a lot more things for Brooklyn. But if he doesn't, right, then obviously, they'll just probably remain where they are.
Yeah. I agree with that. And the narrative with Ben Simmons after Katie and Kyrie's departure was, this was supposed to be his team. He's supposed to take over and kind of step into that leadership role, but it hadn't panned out the way that Brooklyn wanted it to, and I'm sure it's not the way that Simmons wanted it to either. But yeah, I agree with everything that you said. He is the epitome of the X Factor. It's he's the definition of it. So we'll see what goes down with that. And then moving on to the West, I'm picking your favorite team, Lakers first.
Right.
And I kind of have two X factors that kind of go hand in hand for me personally. Um,
All right.
can D'Lo shoulder the load along with AD? So the reason why I say that is because D'Lo's been here before. He's been in the situation where Brooklyn, when he was with Brooklyn, I think they were the eighth seed or something like that, and they had a playoff appearance, and he torched, he was going off, but the team wasn't playing the best, but he was getting his. So could we be looking at a similar situation with this? But he has more help with AD. But I think if D'Lo plays well through this last stretch and hopefully into the playoffs, I think we could see a second coming and a resurgence of his career because for a long time he kind of got memed a lot for the loading thing and all that stuff. Still loading, all kinds of memes, but
Right.
I can only hope for the best, and I just want to see him succeed so badly. And he's a great 3-point shooter, and that answered the cry for help that you guys desperately needed. So hopefully it can continue to the playoffs alongside AD because I love the PNR game.
Yeah. Since he's come to LA, right, he's been averaging about 16 points, 6 assists. He shot the ball pretty well, close
Yeah,
to 50% from the field, over 40 from three, right? So that's kind of the prototype guard that would kind of be pretty useful next to this version of LeBron and
yeah,
AD, right? Because obviously a few seasons ago, you didn't when the Lakers won the title, they didn't really have like a prototypical point guard. You had LeBron basically running point, with 2, 3, and D guys in the backcourt. But now
right,
that LeBron's obviously older, you don't want him to carry the load as much. So you want another guy that can kind of create his own offense. So you want a
right,
skill guard. And I guess that was kind of the idea as to why they initially got Dennis Schroeder 2 seasons ago.
true,
Um, but he's just not a good enough shooter to be a skill guard, especially as a starter, right? And then that turned into Westbrook, right? Who is obviously kind of a worse, who's a worse shooter, not worse than shooter, not a worse player than shooter, right?
Right.
But a worse shooter.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and so I think D'Angelo Russell definitely is the X factor because he's, he was kind of the biggest name in the trade for Westbrook, that came back to the Lakers, right? And it was kind of the one that nobody really expected,
Right.
right? Because some people thought, maybe if they're doing a deal with Utah, maybe they get back Mike Conley, um, or maybe they do a deal with some other team and get back some other guard, right? D'Lo wasn't really a name that was really mentioned at all. I know that there have been rumors that maybe he might get moved, but the Lakers were never involved in those. So I think for him, it's kind of like what we talked about, where he's also playing for a new contract, right? So if he plays well, right, then obviously he'll get that contract. So
Yep.
it's kind of important, that the Lakers get into the play-in or the playoffs, wherever they need to finish. And if they do, a big part of it is going to be because he's playing well, right? Because we know LeBron's going to be out, for a while. So the only way they're going to really be able to get into the play-in is if D'Angelo Russell and AD, you know, uh, figure out their combination, and it's been good so far, right?
Yeah.
So, with the pick and roll, you have to guard it differently than you guarded it with Westbrook and AD or Schroeder and AD.
Right.
So for now, it's been really good. Since they've done that trade, I think they're like 8-3. So that's obviously really good. That's a big difference, and
Yep.
that's kind of what's propelled them into getting back into the playoffs. So yeah, I would definitely say that that's the X factor for them because you know what LeBron and AD are going to bring.
Right.
And obviously, there are other guys, right, in terms of role players, but Russell's the guy that obviously all eyes are going to be on, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's a good one.
It's a great move.
Yeah. So mine is the other LA team,
Okay.
the Clippers. So my X factor, I guess at this point, I think this is kind of obvious, is Westbrook. So my kind of question, I guess, is how many minutes will he play come playoff time? So when he first came to the Clippers, right, he was playing a higher amount of minutes, right? He was typically
Yeah.
playing like, in the upper 20s, low 30s. Um, right. And of course, he played 39 minutes his first game, right? But that was the double overtime game against the Kings. So it kind of makes sense that he'd play a lot of minutes there as a starter. The last couple of games, he's played 23 minutes. And that's kind of coincided with the Clippers winning 3 in a row. Obviously, Kawhi's been great. So I feel like if they can kind of manage his minutes, it'll be kind of like what we said, where, obviously we don't want him as a starter, but we also said if he's playing in a more limited role, right, then it will probably be more effective. Whereas if
Right.
you're asking him to play over 30 minutes a game, starting and closing, then that's going to be tough. So I think it's, for them, the X factor is how do they manage the Westbrook minutes, right? Who's he playing alongside when he's on the floor?
Right.
How long does he play? When does he come out? When does he come in? Does he close? And I think that's going to be the X factor for them because with Kawhi, if he continues to play like this, obviously, again, they have a chance against a lot of teams. You need Paul George, obviously, to continue his level of play, sliding in as that number 2, right? And then obviously you got other guys, right? Marcus Morris has to be better. Some of the guys they got at the deadline, obviously they need to continue playing, right? Gordon, Plumlee. So for them, like I said, I think the X factor is Westbrook and the minutes he plays. Because if he plays a lot, I think that's going to be a real problem. But if he plays fewer minutes, as long as he's okay in those minutes, I don't think it'll kill them too much. But again, we'll have to see because the playoffs are different, right? And there could be a scenario where even if he's just out there, right, it could just harm them. So, but that's my X factor for them.
Yeah, that makes sense totally. And he's kind of similar to Ben Simmons, where he's the definition of the X factor because if he's out there, he could either hurt you or help you tremendously. It just depends on the situation and how they're using him and utilizing him. And like you said, I think a minimized bench role would fit him perfectly because there can be sets where he's running the floor himself. But alongside the starters, I just don't see it working, especially in the playoffs, where you have teams that are a little bit more deep and seasoned and offensive powerhouses too. That's one thing that we didn't talk about is they're probably going to go up against a lot of really good offensive teams in the playoffs if they make a deep run. But and Westbrook's defense has kind of been lacking recently, so it all comes down to how they use him. So I agree with you. Um, so my next question is for the Timberwolves. Um, and the X factor for me is Anthony Edwards because he plays phenomenal. We all know what he can do. We all know the potential is there. But, you know, can he do it in the playoffs? That's the question. Um, he's young, and like I said, we know what he can do, but we don't necessarily know what he can do in the playoffs. You know, it's kind of like a first time thing for him. So we'll see what goes down. But I'm sold on him, so I think he can do it. But it's all up to perspective because we don't know.
So obviously, with Anthony Edwards, I mean, obviously since Karl Anthony Towns has been out, he's been really good,
Yeah.
right? Obviously, he was named as an All Star, first time All Star. So he's definitely gonna be the key, right? He's in his what third season,
I
right?
think
Yeah,
so.
so
Third, yeah.
third season. Um, and he's kind of at this point, I think most people would probably say he's the team's best player at this
Oh
point.
yeah,
I feel like most people would probably say he's eclipsed Towns
yeah,
in that role. So, you're going to be relying on him. He's going to have the ball in his hands. Obviously you have Mike Conley as a veteran point guard to kind of help stabilize things. But, how he reacts to his, this is kind of the first playoff series where he's going to probably be the
the
go-to
guy.
guy, right?
Yeah,
Because last year it was kind of him and Towns.
right.
But I feel like now that, like I said, now that he's eclipsed Towns, it's going to be his team, and they're going to run a lot of things through him. And also it's a different team, right? Because now if Towns comes back and he's healthy, it's Towns and Gobert. And you do kind of wonder in the playoffs, how is that going to work?
Right.
Obviously, it might depend on who they play, right? But it's going to be interesting to see how that combination fares because teams typically close with smaller lineups at the end of games. And, the issue with Minnesota is, you almost have to close with both guys, right?
Yeah.
Because they're both getting paid max money. But then, your issue with Gobert is that he can't necessarily punish a team for going small,
Right.
right? So, I mean, I think that's going to be the key for them is can Edwards maximize what he can do with those two guys? Because,
Yeah.
it feels like, when one of them's on the floor, it's not necessarily too bad. But if both of them are on the floor, it may be a problem because, he needs to be able to get to the rim and have space to create offense. So, and I think you have to kind of set everything up through him because I think they should because he's their most talented and most skilled player, I think.
Yeah, for sure. All great points. I agree with them.
So my next team is Dallas.
Okay.
So for them, their X factor I think is going to be obviously the defense, late game offense. They've had some real problems closing out games. I believe they're 5-6, right, since they've traded for
Yeah.
Kyrie. So not necessarily great. Obviously, they've also had some bad luck, right? Because last game against the Grizzlies, both Kyrie and Luka were out with injuries. We don't know how long Luka is going to be out. Don't know how long Kyrie's going to be out.
Right.
But even when they've both been out there, it hasn't been great. I think offensively, obviously, it's fine. Of course, late in games, it's a problem. But the main issue is they can't stop anybody. So unless they score 120 plus every night, right, it's going to be really tough for them to be able to, beat teams because you have to be able to play defense in the playoffs, right? You can
Right.
kind of get away, I guess, in the regular season without scoring teams, but not in the playoffs when teams can, kind of scheme against you and make it tougher for you to score, and then kind of punish you, for whatever defensive lapses you have. So, I mean, we talked about the trade at the time. We liked it more for Brooklyn just because it felt like Dallas was still kind of incomplete. If they had made more trades at the deadline and,
Yeah.
kind of solidified, some more help on the wings, right? Or, move Christian Wood because it just feels kind of pointless to have him, come off the bench, when he's making the money he's making and we don't know if he's going to come back with
Right.
Dallas. So, for them, I just feel like it's going to be really tough come playoff time. And again, they have to get there first because they're kind of in a similar situation as some of these other teams where they're basically a play-in team right now, and they kind of have to, grind it out. And again, if Luka and Kyrie are going to be out for a stretch of games, that's going to be tough because there's just not a whole lot of time to fix stuff because we're basically in the home stretch of the season, right? Every team's basically got like 15 or so games remaining.
Yeah.
So for them, this is kind of the time where they're going to have to push it. And if they get there, that's their X factor.
Yeah. Defense is either gonna, you know, propel them to wins or kill them. So, and we've talked about it multiple times on the podcast. And I picked them to go pretty far in the playoffs, and that has not been panning out. They might not even really go beyond the first round, to be honest. But, yeah, I would have to agree with you on that. And if I was posing that question, I would also have to include Kyrie, just because you don't know what his
Right.
mindset is going to be towards Dallas. Is he there long term? Is he there short term? Is he just there because he has to be? You don't know with Kyrie, so I would probably add in Kyrie as along with their defense. Um,
Right.
so for my final team in the West, I've got the Kings, and it's not even a player that's the X factor to me. I think it's the coach. So Mike Brown is my X factor, and I
Mhm.
think that he's a great coach, and he's very underrated. I believe he won Coach of the Year in like 2009 or something like that.
Yeah, with LeBron,
Yeah, so
the
he
Cavs team.
yeah, he's coached a lot of like good players in my opinion. And I think he's honed in on what Sacramento was missing, and he figured out the system that works for them. And I think it'll work for them in the playoffs. We just don't know because we haven't seen the lineup in the playoffs yet. But
Right.
they this is the second time the franchise has ever gotten to 40 wins, I believe. So, or no, I don't think it's ever. Is it ever?
First time since 2006, I think.
2006. Yeah, that's what it was. So, yeah, I mean it's a good look for Mike Brown, and I think going forward, it's probably gonna come down to game time decisions for him, and he's got to keep Fox in the game for as long as possible, but not burn him out. It's
Right.
gonna come down to rotations and making the right calls, and I trust him, so that's my X factor for the Kings.
Yeah, it's kind of been an interesting ride for him, right? Because there had been stretches where he was looked at as a really good coach.
Right.
And then obviously I believe he coached, LA, right?
Yep.
And it didn't necessarily work
Yeah.
out there. And then he kind of just bounced around as an assistant. He had been an assistant in Golden State for a while.
Right.
Kind of known as more of a defensive minded coach, right? But in
Right.
Sacramento, they've been purely offense, right? They're, one of the best offensive teams, but they're also one of the worst defensive teams. Now, unlike, say, Dallas, they're one of the best late game offenses.
Right.
So so usually when it's a close game, they're usually able to get it done. So I think in that case, you probably would trust them, more to kind of like, be able to get just one stop and then score.
Yeah.
Whereas with Dallas, you don't know if they're going to be able to score or get a stop.
Right.
But at the same time, they don't have a Luka Doncic, but that Sabonis Fox tandem has been very good. They have a lot of guys out there that can help you offensively, right? Kevin Herter, Malik Monk off the bench, right? Trey Lyles as a backup forward has kind of been a revelation.
Yeah.
Um, so they have a lot of different pieces. It just kind of depends on like can they just get slightly better defensively? But again, that offense has been really good, and it's going to be tough to stop, right? Because that's the other factor, that you have to take into account, right? Depending on who they match up against, how good defensively is that other team, right? Because if they're going against the lower seeded team, unless it's a team like maybe Golden State, right, or maybe the Lakers, right? If it's like someone else like Dallas, right, I don't think Sacramento should be super concerned
Right.
because they'll be able to score on Dallas all day long. Although I guess Dallas could too. Um,
Sure.
so I think for them it's going to be more matchup dependent. But at the same time, it's kind of like what we said in the previous podcast. If they don't come out of the first round, I still wouldn't look at the season as a disappointment because
Yeah.
they've still been way better than anybody expected. Right?
It's great.
They're second in the Western Conference right now, the best team in the Pacific Division, at least record wise. So I mean, this is pretty much kind of like a dream come true if you're a Kings fan. And it's a really cool story because again, they had the longest streak of missing the playoffs in professional sports. So, it's kind of been an interesting turnaround for them this year. And, I thought they'd be better, right? But I didn't necessarily expect them to be this good, right?
Yeah.
Especially in a season where, a lot of teams kind of have like average-ish records. For them to be one of those few teams that have like an above average record was not what I saw coming.
Yeah. I thought they were going to be a lower seed, but it's great.
Yeah.
And with Mike Brown, I think he can take them pretty far.
All right. So for my last team, I had the Denver Nuggets.
Okay.
So my X factor, it's kind of a couple of things, right? It's that Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr. combo. They've been, pretty good obviously this season because they've helped, obviously helped Denver get to that number one seed. But the only thing is that again, with a guy like Jamal Murray, he's coming off of injury. He's had some stretches where it seems like his knee or something is still bothering him.
Right.
I saw, when they lost to Brooklyn today, right at home, which they've barely lost at home this season, right? He was kind of grabbing at his knee at different points. that's just kind of something to factor in. And Michael Porter Jr. also, his injury history is really scary.
Yeah.
Because he's had a lot of stretches where he's, had to miss time. And they were gone for most of last year pretty much. So, if they have any issues, in terms of not being able to stay on the floor, that's going to be a problem. And then the other concern I have for Denver, so this is kind of like two things in one, is the bench. I feel like hasn't been
Okay.
that amazing. I mean,
Right.
obviously with when Jokic is off the floor, it's not going to be that amazing, but I feel like the pickups that they made at the deadline, it just feels like they haven't been that great. Reggie Jackson's been okay. But then like Thomas Bryant hasn't really played at all. I mean,
Right.
he's played some, right? But obviously, like it's kind of a weird situation, right? Because when he got traded, the report was that he requested to be traded from the Lakers because when AD was coming back, his minutes were going to go down. Because he was playing a lot and putting up a lot of big numbers while AD was out. But
Right.
now he's in Denver playing behind Jokic, still not really playing a whole lot, playing, I guess, now fewer minutes, right?
Technically,
Because
yeah.
Jokic doesn't even get hurt at all, right? Because,
Right.
unlike, say, AD, Jokic is very rarely going to miss time. So that's kind of a weird situation. So it just feels like they didn't improve at the deadline as much as they kind of, I thought, should have.
Right.
I mean, obviously, it's going to be hard to match up like with what Phoenix did in terms of getting KD, but
Yeah.
it just feels kind of weird, because there could be a scenario where, hey, they have the best record in the West, right? But then it might be all for naught, depending on, who they play maybe in the second round or something like that. And that's just kind of a weird situation to be in. And again, in terms of the supporting cast, right? Like you look at some of these other teams, right? Phoenix, you got Booker, Durant, Chris Paul, Aiton, right? That's your four, right? And like I think that's probably a better four than what Denver has. With Jokic, Porter, Murray, Aaron Gordon, right? That quartet.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of the X factor for them is, their, second, third guys, and that bench because it just feels kind of odd at times, and it just feels like it could really become problematic against certain teams.
Yeah. I agree with you. A lot of question marks for MPJ and Jamal Murray. I brought it up on the last episode, and that was the one thing that I had an issue with. I'm not as concerned as you with their bench, but I'm really concerned about Jokic's number two and number three. And if you kind of substitute and plug and play, with dealing with hypotheticals, like if you bring in another number two and number three outside of Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr., you wouldn't have these questions. And I think it's just because of their youth and, like you said, injury history. That's what all it comes down to. But Denver does have some question marks, but they are the best team in the West, so we can't really refute that.
Yeah. All right, so that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We appreciate the support. Especially with those YouTube shorts. That we've been pumping out for everybody.
Yeah.
So thanks for listening. Have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you Thursday.